Yes, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV and of course to our continuing coverage of the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. Now there were literally hundreds of very nice machines on display at Telford this year, and through my video channel we hope to bring you a selection of some of those very nice machines. So we're going to continue now with part 3, and this is a selection of bikes that were on display at the Wolf Sports stand over the course of the 2 days. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into the video. Okay, so as we continue our coverage from the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, we are now going to take a look at 3 of the nice machines that were sitting on Bill Brown's Wolf Sports stand. And first up, it's one of Bill's quite nice looking 490 Maicos, which are, as you know, based around the legendary 1981 Mega 2, although these bikes here that builds at his Wolf Sport International premises at Lily Hall in Cumbria are a slightly more modern interpretation of that legendary motocross racer. Now, as far as I know, the frames that are used on these bikes are basically just a carbon copy of the original 490 design, but instead of being painted in Maico red, these new style chassis are all given a coat of chrome plating rather than being simply covered in paint. But again, there's no introduction required when you see this 490 Maico power plant, because the history and successes of these engines has been well documented down the years. A simple two-stroke German designed motor that had grunt in absolute bucket loads and then some. And as big open class motocross engines go, these 490s were and possibly still are one of the most powerful motocross race engines of its day. Now, this featured engine here is of course the more desirable reed valve version, which was an upgrade on the earlier piston port motor, and as you can see, it's also fed its fuel through the stock Bing carburetor, which seemed to suit this motor perfectly, and these old Bings did have a good reputation for making big power on these 490 power plants. And once again on these new Maicos, gone of course are the old heavy steel swing arm, which are replaced by this Wolf Sport alloy box section parts, but there are a lot of replacement items on these newer Maicos, and many of them are specifically manufactured for Wolf Sport, and these plastic slimline fuel tanks are just one of those aforementioned items, complete of course with their Maico motocross new graphics on the side. But certainly a smart looking twin shock, and very quick as well, powered by that 490 reed valve two-stroke Maico motor. But if you do need any information on some of the parts and other products that Wolf Sport supply, then why not just drop them an email at this email address. Now, also sitting proudly on the Wolf Sports stand was Bill Brown's beloved Trico, which was certainly attracting quite a lot of attention over the course of the 2 days. And for me, personally speaking, if there was one bike that I'd love to have bought and then gone home with from the show, then it probably would have been this fantastic twin shock specimen. Now, the frame naturally is a 1981 Maico 490 chassis that's undergone some surgery to accommodate this lovely twin cylinder Triumph 4-stroke motor. But you may remember that we have already documented the build and the story of this bike in a previous video here on my channel, but essentially Bill Brown built this bike some years ago to replace the original Trico that he built some years before. And Bill always maintains that selling his original Trico was one of the biggest mistakes that he ever made, which was one of the reasons that gave him the impetus to build this new replacement. But our Trico's never actually been raced as yet, but who knows, maybe one day we will see it out there on the track. But actually I'm a bit surprised that Bill brought his Trico along to the show, because it was under similar circumstances when he lost his original bike years before, when he had it parked up quite neatly in the paddock at a local four-stroke motocross race event, when along came a Triumph motorcycle fan with a bag full of money and offered Bill a crazy price that nobody in their right mind would have refused, and so he then let go his one-of-a-kind machine. But as I said, Bill is still kicking himself even to this day for doing that deal, but at least now he's got some consolation with this brand new replacement. Although there's certainly something about the combination of this Triumph twin motor and the German Maico frame that looked like these could have been just made for each other, and once more Bill's made good use of his mountain of Maico spares by fitting a pair of 490 forks onto the front of his brand new bike. And he's also kept the stock Maico front brake hub and brake as well, but that gold anodized alloy brake backplate is yet another Willsport produced product. But that front and rear wheel is a Takasago XL alloy rim, which once more has been laced onto a Maico rear hub. Now in the rear suspension department we have a pair of piggyback RPM shocks, which once more are a Willsport product, and these shocks have quite a good reputation for their performance and build quality, and what's more, these are fully serviceable and tunable to every rider's weight and personal riding style. Although certainly everything about this bike just looks the goods, and if you've watched my other videos of this bike, then you'll know how great it sounds as well through those twin straight through pipes. But as I said, for me personally, this Maico Triumph combination was definitely one of the more outstanding bikes at the show. And so that brings us quite nicely to our third machine from the Willsport stand, which is this pre-production 1982 490 Maico, which was actually built in 1981, and this was a pre-production bike in one of the very first monoshock machines built by Maico, and was more or less their pre-production prototype for the 1982 launch. Now it's said that the actual design of this featured bike was never put into production, and although you may think that this is identical to a 1982 model, that's just about where the similarity ends. Now this bike is currently owned by this man here, Norbert van Dun, who has in his collection some of the rarest Maicos on the planet, and when it comes to being the godfather of everything associated with the German Maico factory, then the knowledge and the information that Norbert possesses is almost encyclopedic. So let's just take a quick look at the bike, which Norbert did tell me was the very first of only 8 monoshock motorcycles made by Maico, and as I said, this was a pre-production machine that was supposed to be a template for the new 1982 bikes. Now, it's also said that the reason that these bikes never went into production was all down to this rear shock linkage system, which the motocross bigwigs of the day argued that this was basically just a copy of the shock linkage that was developed by Honda 2 years earlier. So I expect that there was some kind of legal wrangle going on for copyright, and let's face it, by 1982 Maico had already had enough court appearances by then, so I expect that that's why they never continued with this design on the 1982 models. Although, having said that, this link shock layout was said to be designed by Kent Olens from Sweden, and the initial testing and development work on the bike was done by Hans Maisch and Ivan van de Broek. But I expect that this linkage was just far too similar in its design to the Honda patent, which is why this layout wasn't used on the new Maicos. Although one of the other innovations of this pre-production prototype Maico frame was that the steel box section type rear swing arm was actually made up of 2 U-shaped pieces of steel that were then pressed together and then welded. Now, I'm certainly no engineer, and as to why Maico would use these 2 kind of U-shaped profiles and then press them together to form a square, I'm not exactly sure why, but maybe some of my more knowledgeable YouTubers out there will have a much clearer explanation. But this reference to the Poggi Polini titanium on the side is also a bit baffling, because the swing arm is without doubt a steel item, but then again, this could just be quite simply a sticker to add a bit of colour to that red swing arm. And again, this aluminium airbox was another bespoke part that was quite unique to our prototype bike, as it had to be designed around that rear monoshock, and of course allow enough room for clearance for the suspension movement. Although when it came to our 490 Maico motor, I was never really supplied with any information on its associated parts, or indeed if any kind of modifications or upgrades had been done to it. But even in their stock standard trim, then you'll know as well as I do that these 490s are still pretty damn quick. And as in our previous Maico 490, still using the tried and trusted Bing carburetor. But as far as I know, the bike's front forks are just your stock original items from 1981, because as I said, this bike was actually made in 1981 as a pre-production 1982 model, so it still has more or less the same front end from an 81 twin shock 490. And again, that single monoshock rear suspension unit had this Öhlins remote gas and oil reservoir to contain the fluid and the gas for that rear shock, fixed naturally, of course, to the front of the chassis so that it could enjoy all of that nice, cool, on-rushing air to try and keep the temperature down, as these units did tend to heat up if the rear shock was worked hard on a bumpy racetrack. But our bike still has the original 81 hub and front drum brake, and even more surprisingly, the original Spanish Acront alloy wheels, which were a standard fitting on these Maicos back in the day. But even for a relatively small old school drum brake, this front stopper did manage to slow the bike down a bit, but pulling as hard as you could on that front brake lever, you'd still never be able to make this open class racer stand on its head. Now, I'm not exactly sure as to how much testing our pre-production bike actually did during its life, but this Maico expansion chamber is certainly in great shape and relatively ding and dent free, because as you know, it was more or less a constant battle keeping these pipes in their proper shape when they were in regular use on the racetrack, and removing track damage from stones and other debris was all part and parcel of these expansion chambers routine servicing. But generally these Maico tailpipes did tend to last the life of the machine, mainly because most of the time these were far from the worst of the track damage, although they could certainly get a stone or two thrown up from that back wheel. And as you can see, the now familiar plastic Maico fuel tank, which Maico introduced in 1980 when they switched from those much nicer looking alloy tanks of the 1979 bike to these plastic items, which, as I remember, always seemed to be a bit of a pain to try and get graphics to stick onto their sides. But I can certainly remember the seat on my old 1980 440 being quite a comfortable spot to rest your backside on back in the day, and it doesn't look like Maico have changed much on this pre-production bike. But proper old school handlebars and controls on our 490, no clamps on that racing crossbar, of course, just proper factory welding straight from the Maico manufacturers. But once again, the steadiest of hands is required on this Maico's on and off switch, and if you turn the gas on a bit too quick with this gasser throttle, then the power of that big 490 motor could certainly catch you out if you've not got your wits about you, because I think these 490s were reputed to have around the 48 horsepower on tap, but when this rocket ship took off, it certainly felt like a lot more. Although, once again, another fine machine from the Norbert Van Dun Maico collection, and you have to say a big thanks here to Norbert for hiking this bike all across Europe to have it here on display at this year's 2023 Telford show. And as I said, this was just one of the many rare Maicos that Norbert has in his collection, but a nice, interesting machine, and just one of only 8 motorcycles made by the Maico factory as pre-production models that they had hoped to launch in 1982, but unfortunately they never did because of that rear shock linkage scenario. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around the Wolfsport stand at the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. Bill Brown's lovely 4-stroke Trico there, and of course Norbert Van Dun's quite rare pre-production 490 Maico. Now, coming up in part 4, it's time to take a look at the little 125 air-cooled bikes that were on display at the show. So we'll have a selection of those machines when we return to part 4, and they will also include this lovely 1979 Honda CR125. So I hope you'll join me for my next video here on my channel, but until then, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well. So until the next time, it's bye for now.